Years ago, when my journalism took me off into London, the first thing I did was buy the Observer newspaper for the latest television review by Clive James. He was the talk of the town. Everyone wanted to know what Clive James thought about what they were watching. Pretty soon, he was on TV himself, writing and presenting studio series and specials on politics and the arts. Clive James went on to become one of our generation's most influential cultural critics, and people still want to know what he thinks. They filled a hall at his recent visit to the New York Public Library. This native of Australia can shame any rival polymath with his creativity. Best-selling author of over 20 books, 4 novels, poetry, essays, 3 memoirs, and now the founder of his own multimedia website, a virtual who's who of British cultural life. This is his latest book, Cultural Amnesia, 100 short essays on 20th century thinkers, villains, and heroes. It's been called the work of a lifetime, one man's crash course in civilization. Clive James, welcome to the Journal.
Bill, I'm honored.
You dedicate this book to 4 women.
Yes.
Why?
Well, it's a feminist book, really. It's because I think many of my generation who grew up during World War II, when the men were away at the war, and some of them didn't come back, including my father, and the women were all around us, and we got the idea it would be a better world if they were running it. And I still think that, and it's actually dedicated to women who are, in my view, heroines. 2 of them are Ayan Hirsi Ali and Aung San Suu Kyi of Burma, and Sophie Scholl, who is the German, she was a kid really. She was 21 years old when she was executed by the Nazis.
Roman Catholic.
Yeah, 1943, yeah.
Stood up.
Yeah,
why did you choose her?
Well, the White Rose Resistance Group is a fascinating little bunch of kids. There wasn't much they could do. They could print a few pamphlets. This is late 1942. Stalingrad hadn't even happened yet. And all they could do was print a bunch of pamphlets and spread them around, protesting about the Nazi regime and its treatment of the Jews, etc. And they knew what would happen if they got caught, and they got caught, and did happen. And Sophie actually could have walked away, because the Nazis realized that on the whole it would have been better PR if she did, but she wouldn't, and she took the hit along with her brother. And it's a great, great story. It's well known in Germany by now. It wasn't during World War II. The Nazis sat on the news.
Sure.
And it was slow to spread after World War II, but now she's a heroine there, and should be all over the world, I think.
What, because?
Because she wasn't Anne Frank. See, Anne Frank, great as she was, Anne Frank was a victim. She was going to die anyway. Sophie didn't even have to. Sophie did it because of her solidarity with people like Anne Frank. She was saying there's a basic human bottom line which you can't cross, that you have to stand up and be counted. The truth is, most of us don't stand up and be counted. It takes heroism to do it. She was just a natural heroine. Her story has endless implications, which I try to bring out. One of the ways the book works is it starts arguments, you know? It says, this is the nodal point. This is where you start thinking about, would you have done this, for example? Do you know anyone who has this kind of courage? Wouldn't you prefer to get on with your life and let those things happen to other people?
I was pleased to see that you had included in your dedications Hirsi Ali, because I interviewed her last year, and I found that quiet witness that she gives to her own conscience against this great, overwhelming animosity from her own believers.
She is tremendous, and of course she's right in the focal point of history now. Some people think she's trying to do too much. She wants to change the whole of Islam. And there are others, and me included, who think that there are some ways that you should try and influence Islam in order that the moderates can stand up to the extremists. Ayan Hirsi Ali wants a lot, but what she wants is fundamental to her and to women, I should imagine. I can't imagine why the feminists in the West aren't fully and unequivocally allied with Ayan Hirsi Ali on this issue, but they are not.
What do you want young people most to remember about the 20th century?
I want to remember what we remember, and you and I remember because we were there, right? We were.
You're 5 years younger than I am, so we shared that same World War II, post-war, Cold War.
See, I can remember when we were young. I can remember a time when freedom was under genuine, ferocious threat from the Nazis, from Imperial Japan, and we later realized from the Soviet Union as well. And things were in the balance in World War II. In fact, America saved us. That's why I could never be completely anti-American, because as an Australian, we were saved by America. And there's a terrible truth about history in the 20th century, right through until now, which was uncovered by a marvelous American writer, Samantha Power, in her wonderful book, Genocide, A Problem from Hell. It's one of the things that makes this book valuable. She reached a conclusion she didn't want to reach. She reached the conclusion that genocidal regimes will never be stopped unless unless someone intervenes, unless they run out of victims. But if they don't run out of victims, they won't be stopped unless someone intervenes, and the person who intervenes is usually the U.S. And she traces it from 1915, when Theodore Roosevelt, ex-president Theodore Roosevelt, as he then was, wanted to intervene in Armenia and couldn't, and save the Armenians from the Turks, and couldn't do it. She traces from then what seems to me the incontrovertible fact that America is the decisive influence, for good or ill, sometimes for ill, in the whole business of stopping the maniac from killing everybody he wants to kill. You've got it right now in Darfur. Can I give you an example?
Sure.
Very, very short. Right now in Darfur, the British papers who have been opposing the Iraq, what they call the Iraq War, although the war only lasted a few days, what they're really objecting to is the mess that's been made of the Iraq peace. The very papers that make most mockery of the US and of Bush's initiative and the neocons and so on are now writing headlines, "The world stands by as Darfur suffers." What they mean when they say the world stands by, when they say that we're waiting for the world to intervene, they're really saying we're waiting for the Americans. What are the Americans going to do? And you might say, well, the Americans can't do anything because they're so hopelessly tied up in Iraq and Afghanistan. But that is really what it comes to. The UN has been, it's taken the UN 4 years to decide there's something going on in Darfur. And really, what America does is really decisive, and that's what we find it also uncomfortable to live with if we're not American.
The lesson I take from this is that barbarism is a phenomenon that always lies just below the surface of
just here.
Just there. And in the 20th century, it got institutionalized in the state.
Yeah, yes. It's even worse than that. It's not just here, it's in here. The propensities for barbarism are in all of us. They're probably part of our original energy. When you throw a tantrum, when you're a kid, what did you say? I'll kill you, right? You disagree with me? I'll kill you. That is now fundamental to politics in the world. Do what I say or I'll kill you. It's a tantrum. It's within the human personality. It's always there. It's held back, as Freud saw. He thought the society was civilized to the extent that it had overcome nature. In other words, he thought this kind of tendency to massacre everyone who disagrees with you was natural, and I'm afraid it is. And civilization is that very thing. It's the steady accumulation of institutions over the course of history which has brought us up to where we are now, where we can disagree with each other without falling into
this barbarism that sits there, organized and powerful in the 20th century, hasn't disappeared. Darfur, as you say, 9/11, the radical elements of Islam. I mean, it's still here. What the deuce good is humanism against this intense barbarism?
The constant message of my book is you must pursue humanism for its own sake. A utilitarian view won't work. You've got to know and love these things for their own sake. You hope, on the other hand, that it will do something to offset the advance of barbarism. But I wouldn't say that if you get enough humanism fast enough, you'll stave off barbarism. For one thing, fate or God or whatever it is that eventually rules us all may not care if we survive. There's no guarantee that civilization will continue. It's always shown fairly robust signs of being able to overcome any kind of totalitarian organization. The interesting thing about World War II was that the Nazis were quite well organized, the Japanese were quite well organized, compared with, say, the US and Britain at the start of the war, which weren't organized at all. I mean, the US had a smaller armed forces than Czechoslovakia in the late 30s. But within a very short time, the democracies organized themselves better. There's something about the creative force of liberal democracy which gives you hope that it can overcome any challenge, including terrorism. I'm sure terrorism can punch very large holes in Western civilization, and probably will. Let's be fatalistic. Yeah? It's very, very hard to stop a bomber who's ready to kill himself. Very hard. But there's also every reason to think that civilization is simply too strong to be brought down by terrorist activity. But I don't want to make any false hopes, and it would be a false hope to say if you learn enough, if you love Botticelli enough, if you listen to Beethoven enough, then the enemy will retreat It's not going to happen.
You say in here that the best time to see into a society is at that moment of dissolution, or when these forces converge. Do you see that?
Yeah, it's like
Western civilization.
It's like if you're the Great Barrier Reef off Australia, when you're sailing along it, it's only when there's a gap in the reef that you can see the way the reef is constructed. And these breakdowns of societies, of cultures, which happened in Russia in 1917, in Germany in 1933, in Austria in 1938, and so on, they give you a hint of how a culture works, because when the pieces break up, you see how it all hangs together. See, everybody, their life disintegrates. Not just the writers, we know all about the writers, but the printers, the publishers, the illustrators, everybody concerned with the whole business of culture are scattered to the winds. And you see, and the school teachers, you see how the society fits together. It's extremely complex and impossible to reproduce through one person's will. This was why Burke was a great thinker.
Edmund Burke.
Yeah, Burke always emphasized the importance of continuity, that you're not going to think of it all by yourself. You're inheriting civilization. What you do is you try to protect it and improve it, but get rid of the idea that it can all start again because a few men think it can. That was exactly what was wrong with the Russian intelligentsia at the end of the 19th century, and that's why the Russian Revolution happened the way it did.
That's what I admire, what you just said about continuity. That's what I admire about principal conservatism, classical conservatism.
Yes.
Then the breakdown of conservatism in this country, as we've seen it in the last few years, is a matter of deep concern, right?
Well, all intellectual tendencies are corrupted when they consort with power. What happened was that a lot of people who should be listened to started to become active, and that modified the whole message. And that's what you're living with now. We'll see what the next administration does. I must say it, that I'm going to put my hand right in the fire here and say, you know, if you don't intervene against someone like Saddam Hussein, who will? See, I thought the reasons for intervening against Saddam Hussein were quite good, especially if you happen to be an Iraqi. On the other hand, you would hope that whoever intervened, and in some ways I think it should have been just the Australians. The Australians.
Why?
Well, 100 guys could have done the whole job and gone away again. It wasn't the war, which was over in a few days. It's what happened next could not have been worse managed.
We're just not good at empire.
Well, I have my own personal opinions, and I
wouldn't
put Bush and Rumsfeld in charge of anything, and I have a particular beef against Rumsfeld, which I won't go into now. It lasts about an hour. I could do a piece about this guy. But when Bush...
Put him in your next book.
Well, there may be a companion volume about 5 years from now, and that would be one of the things.
What would you say about it?
Well, I've got this idea for the patterns of fantasy, why things keep recurring. And the wonderful thing when Bush came to power... Coming to power is the wrong word for a leader in a democratic country. When he was elected, it was suddenly the whole of the Nixon administration, minus Nixon, seemed to come out of the past and become real again. And these ghostly figures suddenly took on flesh, like Cheney, and Rumsfeld, and the world started to tremble.
So what is the consequence of being able to have a second and third chance?
Well, you mean with
Cheney and Rumsfeld and that whole crowd?
Well, it tells you they learn nothing.
they should read Cultural Amnesia, right?
How to learn. One of the things that the book tells you is how to learn from mistakes. The intellectuals, as a whole, in the 20th century, on the left, made a huge mistake in making an emotional investment in the Soviet Union and then in communist China. It was a tremendous error. How much did it teach them? Not a lot.
Is totalitarianism behind us? Is it an artifact of the 20th century?
It's behind us, and I think that the liberal democracies, in all their forms, have no reason to fear it. Where there's a system that votes, it probably won't come back in again. But it continues, because I think it's a virus, it's a spirit, and it's in fanaticism, it's in extremism. The biggest problem we face on the international scale is to protect the majority of Muslims, the vast majority of Islam, to convince them somehow that their extremists are their enemies and not just ours. And if we can't do that, then we don't deserve to survive. And there's a reason why the majority is silent, and there's a very simple one, and that's fear. The extremists are very dangerous.
Are you made uncomfortable by the large influx of Muslims into Britain?
No, I'm not. I'm made uncomfortable only by the fact that the imams are allowed to preach hatred in the mosque.
I don't understand that.
Well,
you don't have a written Bill of Rights.
If you were paying, no, we don't. But if you were paying my taxes, you'd realise you spent years subsidising guys.
No, I recognise that.
They're standing up there preaching murder, and some of the young kids are foolish enough to listen. and how they can be reached, and so is the biggest problem facing Britain. Australia's doing a better job.
How does a liberal democracy deal with the fact that you allow these imams to get up and preach violence against the country that protects them?
Make them do it in English. But that's what Australia is actually doing a better job. First of all, America does a fine job because it's easier in America, because all the Muslims living are in the area of Detroit, and it's the biggest Muslim community outside the Muslim countries. They sing the Star Spangled Banner every morning. You know, American patriotism is much easier to induce. Australia does a pretty good job, better than Britain, because in Australia, a government spokesman, he was actually the Deputy Prime Minister, had the strength to get up there on television and say to all Muslims, you're welcome, of course you are, you're citizens, but your young people must give up the dream that this will ever be an Islamic republic. Australia will never have Sharia law. Forget about it. What you've got here is law, and you must obey the law. He actually got up and said it. This made it easier for moderate imams to shift the top guy. We won't go into detail here, but the top guy was bad news. And he'd been preaching all kinds of racial hatred for years, and he really dished himself when he said that women deserved everything they got if they took their clothes off. Australian women take their clothes off very easily. It's a hot country. And he thought every woman in a bikini was a message from the devil, and he wanted them all treated as if they were enemies. And his own fellow imams managed to shift him. He was obliged to step down. In fact, he was fired.
Yes, I saw that.
What gave them courage to do it was they realized the state was unequivocally on their side. You're dealing with a lot of people here, and only a few want to kill the rest. But it only takes a few. Terror has the advantage. For example, terror wants to destabilize your justice system. The minute you get people proposing new laws where people can be detained forever, it means terrorism is winning. That's exactly what terrorism wants. That will recruit more terrorists. It will turn the jails into Al-Qaeda universities, which is what is going to happen in Britain unless we're very careful. That's why I don't want new laws. You should be able to get the evidence you need on the detention periods that are already established. If you don't get it by torture, you get it by luxury. By luxury. Make sure that they eat better in jail than they do at home, and they'll start telling you things.
Is there a danger in your mind that the young people you're trying to reach will assume that liberty, democracy, prosperity, plenty are just natural states?
Yeah, that's the
that they won't realize the long fight, the long struggle it took to arrive at this point?
Liberal democracy encourages that lack of awareness because it produces contentment, prosperity, happiness, and all these things which are the enemies of knowledge. And the incentive to study history is removed and it has to be replaced. I can only think of one way of replacing it, is to make it fashionable. If you want the kids to study history, to learn Latin, to do all these things, you don't encourage them, forbid them.
Which reminds me, you make a very good point in here that I did not realize about the Jews in Vienna around the turn of the 19th to 20th century, that Einstein and Freud and people like that could not get positions in the universities. So the vital talk, the learning took place in conversations at cafes.
That was true in Germany and especially in Austria. There were quotas and so on. The tendency in the universities was that the Jews were either forced into secondary academic lines. For example, nuclear physics was regarded as a rather down-market thing. The reason why there's so many Jews were in nuclear physics is it wasn't the thing that the top scientists did in universities. And in Vienna especially, because the universities weren't fully open, the Jewish intellectuals were forced into the cafes and tended to develop a language which we are still speaking now, which is the language of normal conversational rhythm about profound things. They took the initiative away from the academy, and in my view, it should always be taken away from the academy. I've got a lot of respect for academics. My wife's an academic. I'm part of an academic milieu. But academic language should not drive the conversation. The conversation should be driven from journalism. I think what we're doing now and what we write in journalism is not incidental to culture, but basic to it. And it was demonstrated by the Jewish intellectuals in the Vienna cafes. They learned to write the article, what they call the feuilleton, the little leaf, the entertaining 1,000-word piece, which is the basis of the whole of modern culture that I find fascinating.
Fascinating that from the margins came...
Oh, yeah. Yeah, but you mustn't deduce from that that there's something good about repression. Repression is
I wanted to see if
it did come from the margins. Yeah.
I wanted to see if there's an analogy between the cafes of Vienna and the internet today.
Oh, sure. And of course the cafes were crawling with maniacs. One of the maniacs in the Vienna cafes was Adolf Hitler. I mean, one of the people whose ideas were flourishing in the cafes was the man who was going to bring it all down with Hitler. And I'm afraid the web is the same. The web is a jungle. I know because I'm in it.
Yes, I know.
And I'm trying to build a clearing.
www.clivejames.com.
Yeah,
right.
It's under my own name. You know, I had to buy my own name back. Some pirate registered every name in England before broadband came in. You have to buy your name back from him, and he charges just a little less than it would cost to sue the guy.
How do you learn to trust what's on the net?
You don't. You don't. You've got to learn and teach a critical awareness. It's just words. One of the many things this book says is watch out for the beautiful style. The beautiful style may be enshrining an untruth. You've simply got to learn to see through the way it's said to what's said. You must always do that. That mental alertness must be, it's there, but you've got to cultivate it. And no, you don't trust anything, and especially not on the web. I mean, a blogger can be in business in 2 minutes, you know. There are terrible things on the web. It's not just that it's 70% pornography. It's a very large percentage of sheer murder. You can watch somebody having their head sliced off on the web if you know where to look. And I think this has got to be counteracted. And it would be a terrible pity to leave that whole area free to the vandals. Creative forces have to get in there somehow. And if I've got an altruistic principle left in my body, it's that one. I'll do that.
In Cultural Amnesia, in so many of your books, and on your website, you are trying to make information available beyond cultural elites. Is that a hopeless call?
No, I don't think so.
In a popular media?
I've always done it. My only originality when I started off as a journalist was I didn't believe in these elites. I thought that intelligence was enough, and if people were intelligent, they'd hear what you had to say. I don't believe that knowledge and understanding and wisdom are the property of a class at all. I believe they're generally democratic things. It doesn't mean everyone will understand, but anyone can, you know? And so that it's still my mission in life, is to write in a way that anyone who can read will realize that I'm talking about something. My enemy is elevated language. When I use the word academic in a pejorative sense, I mean that. The language that puts a distance between the fact being talked about and any possible comprehension, that's the enemy. I really try to write as if I was just saying it. I like to think I can write better than I'm talking now, but there's a connection between writing and talking, which I'd like to maintain for that very reason. It's a political stance.
My
political stance is that learning and humanism should not be shut off from the people. That unless you can present these things in a way that can be understood, then you're losing. The idea that you can retreat into some sort of enclave where only you and your fellow qualified people. Incidentally, this idea was rife in the early 20th century among right-wing intellectuals. T.S. Eliot, for example, and all his friends believed that only a few people were qualified for culture. I do not believe that. I believe, even though it might be a minority, anybody can be qualified.
Are you still a man of the left?
Yes. I'm on the fundamental old-fashioned left that believed in workers' rights. My mother and father were both proletarians. They both worked on the production lines in the 30s if they could get work. The Depression hit Australia very hard. My father went off to the war and never came back. My mother was always poor, brought me up on a war widow's pension. You bet I was on the left. In Australia, we have a concept called the fair go, which is built into the system. It's linked to the basic wage and so on. If you treasure these things as I do, you're on the left. You're on the left forever.
I'm there because my father made the most money in his life, $100 a week, when he joined the union. That was the last 6 jobs. And you know, you and I both came of age when it seemed that nothing was too good for the working man.
I still think workers need protection. I'm still left on that in that sense. It's the fashionable left that bothers me.
By that you mean?
I would call it the pseudo-left, which is automatically thinks that the root of all evil is in Western civilization. It's not necessarily true. In fact, it's not even half true.
But on the right, they criticize you if you are critical of Western civilization and America and democracy because they think you hate America. Yeah. But the fact of the matter is that critical faculty of criticism and self-correcting that is the genius of our society.
Yes,
right?
it is. And you've got to be looking 2 ways if you give any opinion, you know, because you've got to be careful who's agreeing with you, for one thing.
What kind of God would you have reinvent Western civilization?
Well, I wouldn't, because God didn't invent it in the first place. This doesn't make me an atheist. I don't want to be defined as an atheist. any more than I want to be defined as someone who drinks water. To me, the fact that there is no heavenly power that intervenes has been obvious since I was a kid. If there had been, it would have brought my father home. If there had been a heavenly power that could intervene, that power would have saved the children from the death camps. 1.5 million children were being exterminated for no reason at all when I was their age. I never got over it. I still haven't got over it. Of course there's no heavenly force that intervenes. But on the other hand, there is a religious sense. I think that all the arts and everything to do with them are a heavenly order. I experience them as a heavenly order. And if there was a heavenly power, what would he or they do to fix Western civilization? I don't know. Never allow the possibility that there can be any limitation on the right to vote, is what I say.
Your father was an Australian soldier,
yeah,
captured by the Japanese, spent several years in a prisoner of war camp, and then on the way home was killed in a plane crash.
Yeah.
You never saw him again.
I never saw him again. It was one of those things. It was an accident, and many people were dying worse deaths and more futile ones. He went away of his own free will to defend his country and to defend me, and that's what he did. And it was a misfortune that he was captured and sent to Japan. He was in Kobe. He was a slave laborer on the docks in Kobe. It was a tough spot. Got right through the war. Survived, and then this thing happened. It was the Americans with typical generosity, and I'm afraid with typical impetuosity. They laid on a flight of B-24s to fly our prisoners straight back to Australia, so they wouldn't have to wait for a ship. It was a very large-hearted thing to do. Unfortunately, one of the B-24s got caught by a typhoon over Taiwan, and down he went. It's one of those things. It formed my life.
How?
Because I saw my mother take the shock. I was there when my mother got the telegram, and not being able to help formed my view of the world, I suppose. And it told me something about the law of chance, the rule of chance. It's chance that rules the universe, not the heavenly power. If the heavenly power was there, he'd be doing a better job. It taught me a lot. But my mother taught me not to be bitter. She was never bitter against the Japanese. She was never bitter against the Americans, which she could well have been. She taught me a lot.
I suspect the death of your father robbed magic from the world, right?
Yeah, it might be a lot to that. Yeah, I lost faith or interest in the idea of the supernatural. It so obviously didn't apply. You know, we're alone. We're here. We've got to make do with what we've got.
Well, that reminds me of in your book, As of This Writing, you quote Edmund Wilson. Wilson writes, "The knowledge that death is not so far away, that my mind and emotions and vitality will soon disappear like a puff of smoke, has the effect of making earthly affairs seem unimportant and human beings more and more ignoble. It is harder to take human life seriously, including one's own efforts and achievements and passions."
Do you know, I thought he was a great man, but you know, I think exactly the opposite.
Yeah, that was my sense.
As death approaches, I think more and more of the next generation and their importance. And I do not think of the way that he thought, but I thought he was a very great man. But that was his limitation. He was a bit of a misogynist, and I'm not. I'm continually astonished by the creativity of human beings and their bravery, especially women. I've always been impressed by women's bravery. They're on the whole tougher than men.
How so?
Well, they see more of reality. They see blood every month. They are anchored in a way that men are quite often fantasists and idealists. I know I am. It's my bad tendency, which I have to try and control.
The book is Cultural Amnesia. I highly recommend it. Necessary Memories from History and the Arts. Clive James, thank you, and come back.
Bill, I will. It was a pleasure, more than a pleasure. It was an honor. Thank you.
Remember, it doesn't mean much.